Hello again, everyone, and welcome back. It's a deep one today. We're going to talk about how to find your muse, your inspiration for all of those homebrew ideas. One of the best ways to do that is to break your normal routine, so we're going to do something a bit different today. We're going to go on a field trip. Let's get to brewing. Look at that, you can barely tell that this is a different camera. So it's pretty cold out there today, so I'm going to get myself wrapped up and then I'll see you in the woods.
The autumnal forest, the classic setting for finding one's inspiration, wandering amidst the falling leaves and birdsong. This, of course, is where a lot of our storytelling traditions would have started. We think of people camped around the fire telling stories in the woods, and that even makes it into most tabletop adventuring games as the perfect setting for players to roleplay and tell their own stories. When you get down to it, RPGs, perhaps more so than a lot of other games, are stories first. And homebrewing for those games, while it involves a good deal of number crunching and some of the basic principles of game design, is first and foremost an exercise in storytelling.
So, coming out into the woods to look for your inspiration is a bit of a cliche. But it doesn't have to be the woods. It doesn't even have to be anywhere outside. The point is to kind of break your routine, whatever that might be. Do something that you maybe wouldn't normally do, just to get you thinking differently, just to get you kind of in a different frame of mind and distract yourself, basically. You could spend an afternoon gardening, reading a book, working out, drawing, learning a magic trick, going on a bike ride, running, or there's what I used to do before the apocalypse. There used to be these places called cafes that I would go to when I felt like I wanted to get a lot of writing done. They were these sort of rooms where you would sit and there'd be strangers there as well sometimes, and you'd all drink coffee and touch things and breathe in the same space. I know that sounds insane, but trust me, it was a real thing. I'd go to these cafes and sit with my headphones on listening to music and just write for hours. Something about being away from home and being around other people who were just going about their day would help to focus me, and I would usually get quite a lot done. There are obviously limits to what we can do safely today in 2020, but just setting aside the time and the space to get inspired actually goes quite a long way towards getting there, however you do it. Okay, so all of that is just how to get yourself into the right mindset. Let's say that we're there, we're in the zone, we're ready to come up with some good, exciting homebrew. What do we start with? Well, I'm sure people will have all sorts of different answers for this, but what I do is I always start with something really quite small and build up my way around that. Let's take an example of a homebrew that I worked on recently. It was a druid subclass called the Circle of Omens that started out from a really simple idea I'd had about star signs, and actually that thought led to what might end up being my first sourcebook compendium of subclasses and spells and items. I knew I didn't want to do anything based on zodiac signs or horoscopes necessarily, but I liked the idea of interpreting celestial signs and drawing power from the stars or moons, so right there I had a pretty solid theme. I picked a sorcerer subclass at first, because I like sorcerers, and also I had a character who I thought would fit the theme pretty well. But I ended up switching to druid as I unpacked it a little bit more and thought more about how it would actually work within the game. It's perfectly fine to change your mind, it's good even. Nothing gets wasted, you can always come back to the idea you had at the beginning another time. So the main idea that I ran with was a type of character, now a druid, who was marked in some way by the stars, or an omen as it ended up being. The omens themselves seemed like the most fun part to work on, so that's just what I started with. I didn't worry too much about exactly what effect they were going to have on the game in terms of its mechanics, or what powers they might come with, but I came up with some cool ideas, and I put them down to later tweak and revise. And that's important. Don't get bogged down in all of the mechanics at this point. It doesn't matter yet. All we want to do is come up with an idea. All of the other stuff comes later. That's not to say that coming up with mechanics isn't fun or even creative. It is. There's just more to take into consideration, and we don't have the tools to do that yet. So my idea came from a whole bunch of things. I was inspired in part by a character that I was playing in a different D&D game at the time. I was reading some cosmic horror, which I love, and that crept its way in there. What I ended up with was a whole bunch of ideas in a loose sort of Bloodborne, Lovecraft, expansy kind of theme. I was able to pull on each of those things and transpose elements of them into my own design. You'll also find if you're running or playing in a game, your fellow players will do a lot to inspire your ideas. Players in my games are constantly surprising me with the choices that they make. Just recently, I had players try to rescue some random throwaway NPC from being arrested by the city guard. They ended up not only killing the poor guy with a poorly thought out thunderstep spell, but also summoning a demon in the streets. And that's a whole other story. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, so that whole encounter is an example, if quite an extreme one, of how players can be a constant source of inspiration for you. After that happened, I had to think of what the consequences would be, who would get involved, if it would have any significant impact on the player characters themselves. That is all prime material for Homebrew. In a simpler sense, your players, with a bit of encouragement, should let you know if they want to take their character in a particular direction, or if they'd like to explore acquiring a new skill or a new item. So you can be inspired by any number of things on a broader thematic level, like my cosmic horror example from before, or in a more specific way, like trying to come up with something that one of your players has asked for, or trying to recreate a weapon from a movie as closely as you possibly can. It's okay to borrow or even just take parts of things that you've seen elsewhere, especially if it's just for you and your friends at your own gaming table. Sometimes I find an interesting exercise is to take something from a game or a show that I like, or even my own writing, and just directly translate it to a TTRPG as best I can. I've seen whole subreddits based on the varying viewpoints people have about what D&D class Gandalf would be. I reckon probably a fighter sorcerer multi-class of some kind. But then there's Gandalf the White, who seems to have slightly different powers. I wonder if he'd be like more of a paladin or a cleric even? It's a whole thing that I am in no way equipped to get into. But you can do this with anything, and it can be a pretty good way to generate ideas. I actually do this for a lot of games, not just TTRPGs, especially when I'm thinking about designing something for myself. You don't have to have in-depth knowledge about the systems in play of a given game either. I really don't play a lot of League of Legends, and I'm not at all familiar with the intricacies of the game, but I do often find myself using that as a basis to think about what abilities, passives, and ultimates characters from different franchises would have. Try it yourself. Take Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher, put him into League of Legends, put him into D&D. There's actually already a kind of semi-canonical, quasi-official class made by Matthew Mercer, the Bloodhunter mutant, that I think pretty much is Geralt of Rivia, although he might also have a couple of levels of wizard thrown in there. Fighter, maybe? Doing this is sort of like the equivalent of taking your Action Man figure as a kid and like making him fight all of your Legos. He doesn't belong there. Everybody knows it. The little Lego people cowering in their weird multicolored houses certainly know it. It wasn't fair, but it sure was fun. In our next video, those Lego people will get to make their case. Once we're done committing atrocities in the name of inspiration, we'll have to face stark reality once again as we consider where exactly our homebrew fits. What can we harvest from our experiments and our crimes against sanity? Did we discover the potential for a new subclass, or a whole class even? Or did we just create a monster? Or a spell or a magic item? Whatever the answer, the next thing we have to consider is how we actually make it work in game. I do actually have one final piece of advice, a pretty good one I must say, as a reward for making it this far into the video. Whatever you make, especially if it's the first go round, it doesn't have to be the best thing that you ever made. It doesn't even have to be good. That doesn't crack the top 10 things that you want to aim for here. All that matters really is making something. Anything. It's always better to have done something than to have done nothing out of fear of failure. That's some wise old man on a mountain level stuff right there. It's also kind of the whole ethos of this channel. It's a creed I decided to stick to when I started doing this, and it's a very difficult piece of advice to actually follow, especially when you're putting yourself out there for others to see. So don't compare yourself to anyone else, certainly don't compare yourself to me. I don't know what I'm doing, nobody knows what they're doing, so just make something. See you next week, my friends. Until then, have fun.
Okay, how do I get down?
I think that's where you live now, Tom. A little wood elf. He just lives in the trees.